We often rely on mainstream psychology textbooks. But what are we missing by not venturing beyond them? How might a decolonization perspective challenge the dominance of Western thought in psychology and explore how power structures continue to shape the field? In the intersectional lens of queer and trans people of color, how does one navigate the limited psychology scientific literature in order to generate new scholarly work? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Zen. As part of our Pride Month series, today we have Hisham Nsier, a doctoral student in clinical psychology at Loyola University in Chicago. Hisham is interested in identity formation and meaning-making in Middle Eastern and North African communities. His research takes an intersectional approach and focuses on how these individuals are impacted by trauma, as well as the development of culturally informed interventions, particularly those based in mindfulness. As part of his current doctoral training, Hisham serves as a program and clinical research coordinator for the Resistance, Intersectionality, Stigma, and Engagement Lab under Dr. Brian Brooks. Hisham was on the Dean's List, received the Best Oral Presentation Award for a Pediatric Psychiatry Undergraduate Research Program and Learning Experience event, and awarded the William Randolph Hearst Endowed Fellowship for Minority Students. As an Arab American clinical psychology first-year doctoral student, Hisham will be discussing an intersectional, decolonial lens in psychology and the importance of exploring scholarly texts beyond what is taught in mainstream textbooks. Hisham, thank you very much for joining us today and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So you are first year in doctoral studies. Tell me how that's been like for you and, some of the projects you're involved in right now.
Yeah, so I just finished my first year, getting ready for my second year, which will be exciting because I'll be seeing clients for the first time starting in the fall. So that's been really fun. The first year has been a mixture of excitement and pleasure and frustration and stress, obviously, as any graduate program is expected to be. I think all in all, I'm mostly happy to have finally been gotten started on my doctoral studies. It's felt like something that I've been wanting to do for so many years. And to actually be here in this position doing it felt like a dream for the first couple of months that I was finally here.
So this is something you've been working towards for a while. Can you tell me when that spark came for you, where you recognize, hey, this is something you want to pursue?
I would say like most children of immigrants or a lot of folks would probably attest to this, but growing up, my parents were pretty adamant that I had only a few options to choose from career-wise: engineering, law, or medicine. And so for many years, I was kind of on this path of like, I'm going to be a doctor, medicine is right for me. And I was very privileged to have gone accepted into this pipeline program right out of high school at my undergraduate school, where all I had to do was complete the 4 years of undergrad, do some program requirements, and I was all set for medical school. And that was really exciting. And it felt like that was what I wanted to do. Looking back, I think it was a bit naive of me to think that as a 17-year-old, I would know exactly what I wanted to do and that medicine was right for me. But nonetheless, I powered through the first couple of years. The major switch happens for me this summer after my sophomore year. As part of this pipeline program, every summer we have to shadow a couple different doctors in different settings. And I was shadowing an oncologist in outpatient practice and an anesthesiologist at a level 1 trauma hospital simultaneously. And I was already majoring in psychology, so I was taking a few of those introductory classes, and the seed was already kind of implanted in my mind about what psychology is and what it could be. Although I think the main defining point for me was seeing how medicine is practiced in general in this country. I'll start with the oncologist. The oncologist he's a family friend. He's a lovely human being, and his patients adore him. And I noticed how when having conversations about cancer or other really severe blood disorders, his role could only be very what felt like mechanical and routine and like hyper focused on the medical aspect of it, which is understandable because he's a medical doctor. However, I found myself going home every day after shadowing him and being more so preoccupied with the patients and their lives and what these diagnoses meant for them over and above the technical, intricacies of their condition from a medical perspective. And from the anesthesiology side, this memory is so ingrained in my mind of watching a foot amputation of an unhoused individual who was well known to the surgery staff, I guess, for having been in and out of the hospital for many years. They were amputating her foot, and just watching the way that the surgery staff like handled her body after they anesthetized her, and the way that they were referring to her foot and her body, and the way that they were just handling her physically. It's going to sound crude, but it felt like I was watching something be butchered more so than medical practice being delivered. And again, I don't necessarily hold the medical providers at fault for that, because it seems like desensitization to the human condition is the norm in medicine these days rather than the exception. So I don't hold them at fault personally, but seeing it from the outpatient side and the inpatient side made me realize that I couldn't continue in a profession where I would become desensitized by one way or another. And I couldn't be in a position where my role was to focus on the physical part of someone's experience rather than their kind of psychosocial, holistic existence as a human. So I did a lot of deep reflection after that summer, and I realized that, the human condition is what interests me. So that's what I'm going to go and study.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And when you're talking about medical practice surgeries, it is very, like instrumental in terms of, hey, this is a body part. You're studying anatomy. This
Mhm.
is a body part, as opposed to the relationship of this body part to the human experience. It's interesting that early on, you were just inquisitive and questioning, hey, I'm actually curious more about the person that just experienced this foot amputation, this person that just received some sort of treatment for their blood disorder. Um,
Mhm.
Wow, wow. So, in thinking about, having that experience and then making a shift eventually to psychology doctoral program. So that's a major commitment here.
Yeah.
And of course, immigrant myself, as many folks are on the podcast who are also immigrants, they talk about this pressure to pursue something that's more secure, like doctor,
Mhm.
engineering, so forth. What for you took that risk to say, "Hey, let's go with the PhD instead of a master's."
Yeah, I think that my drive toward the PhD was because I have so many questions that I want to focus and address. And as perhaps self-centered as this may sound, I want to be in charge of the questions that I ask. Like I want to be in a position where I have the training, I have the resources and the privilege, let's be honest, the academic privilege to pursue the type of research and inquiries that I want to pursue. And of course, like clinical work is a really big part of why I decided to do psychology. And I view that as being a major part of my career. And at the same time, I think my hesitation with going the master's route was I didn't want to be in a position where I could only really do clinical work. I think, in doctoral programs, we talk a lot about the scientist practitioner model or the scholar practitioner model. And I really do appreciate how there's this drive to incorporate what's happening from a scientific perspective and what we see in the clinical room. And I think a doctoral level program gets us as close as we can to that kind of amalgamation of the two. And, let's be honest, I also am kind of a nerd. And so the idea of writing a lot and reading a lot and having these really high level discussions is something that drives me. And I don't view that as a burden or something that I'm afraid of. In fact, I think it's something that I look forward to a lot moving forward.
Yeah, yeah. It's like you're really intellectually curious about these ideas and wanting to just think more critically about your practice. Yes, you want the flexibility of working with clients and patients. However, there's this other element where you're like, I really want to ask these questions. I want to learn. This is knowledge seeking. So tell me about your current projects that you're working on.
I am collaborating with the University of Chicago for a positive psychology training intervention program that we're doing with the behavioral medicine fellows. So that's really exciting. We get to incorporate some positive psych stuff into a primary care practice. Although my main focus right now is my master's thesis. I'm hoping to propose it by the end of the summer. So that's kind of where most of my creative juices have been going.
Good luck on that. And the master's thesis, what's the topic on that?
It's a mixed method study exploring how Arab Americans, US born Arab Americans, racialization experiences and ethnic identity affect their psychological well being. And the reason why I wanted to explore that for my thesis was it was mostly an inspiration from what's happening in Palestine right now. Before October 7th, I was unsure what I wanted to do for my thesis and dissertation. I was thinking something trauma related, something I'm interested in psychedelics, so I'm thinking something maybe a psychedelic focused thing. I wasn't sure. But then after the October 7th happened, I sat myself down and I had to realize that there's such an intense need for mental health support and research in most communities, but especially in Middle Eastern, Arab American communities here in the US and in the Arab world, of course. And so I told myself, if I don't study these topics, then who will? I can't rely on people outside of my community to do this work because they have their own interests, their own identity. And so it kind of inspired me to become an Arab American psychologist. I never thought that I would have been interested in that before. Maybe it was my own, I guess, in reflecting on it, maybe it was my own kind of internalized racism and discrimination where I was like, no, I don't really want to do that. Like I'm already an Arab, like that's enough. But then in seeing how the community came together after October 7th and seeing the need for healing, it changed my perspective totally. And I'm really excited to get working on it, really.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's amazing that you're pursuing that. I had a chance to speak with several Arab American psychologists on the podcast, and also myself having gone through, doctoral program. When you go to the section of multicultural counseling, usually just one course, that's it.
Right.
You go through a few pages and it's like, wait, what are we learning in terms of, Arab American identity and how it influences treatment? Not much,
Hmm.
not much.
Nope.
It's or it needs to be updated. So I'm
Right.
glad, in many ways proud that you are pursuing this. So you've also talked about, I guess for our show, the main discussion is you mentioned wanting to have a conversation about the intersectional decolonial lens in psychology, and more importantly, ways to explore scholarly texts that's not taught in mainstream textbooks. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, yeah. So for folks on the show who might not be familiar with intersectionality, this is a theory and a practice that originated in the Black feminist movement in the 1900s. And it's really a way for us to think about power in societies and how different interlocking systems of oppression intersect to affect an individual's experience. And without going too much into a rabbit hole about intersectionality, I want to make it clear that the foremothers of intersectionality, and I use foremothers explicitly because this was originated in the feminist movement, the foremothers make clear that if we're not talking about power, it's not intersectional. It's become a kind of appropriated buzzword where people use intersectionality to define the intersection of identities, but without this explicit mention about power structures and how it oppresses an individual, it's not truly intersectional work. And I think it's really important that we think about these perspectives when we talk about decolonization or anti-colonial practice or anti-colonial teaching. Because one thing that I've experienced both in my pre-graduate work in Colorado and currently in my graduate work at Loyola is these words become used as buzzwords to try to, virtue signal or to gain brownie points for promotions and reviews. But the hard work, the inner psychological work and the outer work is not always in alignment with what we say we want to do, if that makes any sense. And I think it's really important for all of us, wherever we are in our academic journey, to critically reflect on the mainstream texts and scholarly work that were taught in our programs or that we're taught to consume, and think about why were these texts chosen? What type of message is it portraying? What are the philosophical assumptions that this work is trying to promote? And in my experience, when I engage the works with those questions in mind, I often find that it served an overarching political and economic and cultural agenda that is supported by the mainstream. At the risk of sounding a little bit paranoid or skeptical, I think it is true that, like psychology training programs, if they're APA accredited, are housed within this larger APA, American Psychological Association structure. And institutions are not the static abstract things. They're made up of individuals, and those individuals have their own biases and assumptions and worldviews and agendas that influence what defines evidence-based practice, what defines accreditation, what part of a training program is worthy of meeting this like abstract standard that's set. And I think, you hate to say it, but institutions like the APA are housed in this larger neocolonial structure because they are part of American society. They're part of the American intellectual tradition that is rooted in modern and postmodern Western thought, which is colonial, neocolonial, and pretty oppressive in its practice. And I think there's a lot of work written about that. And so when I say it, I don't think it's the kind of out of pocket statement. Like, we know this.
It's not. We know this. I mean, it was only recently that APA put out an apology. And of course, some groups declined the apology. So thinking about, critically examining what's being taught, and also just a lack of, say, scholarly material. For instance, I'll use Arab American folks in this context. Like, what do you do as a student when you're looking for material that goes beyond what's taught? Also, just maybe the lack of material.
Yeah, I think in the context of Arab American, it's unfortunately a more of a lack that exists, which is really unfortunate. And I try to fill in that lack by searching for works that are maybe beyond just psychology the way that we think about it. I look into like the art and literature and history and political science, and I think those disciplines complement psychology in a lot of ways because, again, those other disciplines are made up of humans, and psychology is focused on the human experience. And I think those other disciplines have a lot to share when it comes to the Arab American experience. So I try to draw on those traditions and those conclusions as well, which also poses another challenge because in thinking about how the research industrial complex is played out, editors don't really like to see citations from non-peer-reviewed journals if you're trying to make a claim in your introduction or your conclusion. So it's also this extra layer challenge of trying to like rewrite the epistemology or the theory of knowledge that we use when constructing our works. But I'm hopeful that, as the internet has been an amazing tool to increase people's voices, and I am hopeful that the Arab American psychology field will grow. I think it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, yeah. And now tell me more about bridging into intersectional work of, because we are recording this for Pride Month. So, I mean, I would imagine that when you're talking about a marginalized identity, racial identity, and then you add in the marginalized, gendered
Hmm.
experience or identity, I mean, you're talking about very, very limited work. So I was just curious, do you have particular authors that maybe, you lean towards, or just maybe tell me your idea of how you're approaching some of these identity type of work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say I will draw viewers' attention to an article that came out this year, actually, by Aboud, and it's an intersectional qualitative study looking at the intersectional stressors of sexual minority Arab men. Which is actually, it was such a fascinating study because it approached exactly what you were saying about what is it like to live in this country as an Arab man, which so that there's a racial and ethnic stereotype that they have to experience from that perspective. And as sexual minority men, they also have to face homophobia and different types of stressors from American communities and from their own Arab community itself, which I think really highlights the power of intersectionality in approaching these works because it's one of the only frameworks that allows us to see how the racial and ethnic stressors intersect with the sexual minority stressors to produce this very, very nuanced and unique experience that is often left out of the limited scholarly work that we have on Arab Americans to begin with.
So, thinking about just your experience as a person of color, what were some challenges you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
That's a great question. I think there's a lot. Growing up as, an Arab American, Muslim identifying person after 9/11 was challenging. One experience that was so lucid to me, which I think also ignited this fire in me about advocacy work when it comes to Arab Americans, was an experience that I had in my former institution during my postdoc work. So, like most institutions in after 2020, they kind of hopped on this bandwagon of like, no, like we care about social justice. We're gonna come up with all these like, boilerplate statements, and we're gonna redesign our logos to make them more inclusive, yada yada yada. Like all these things that institutions did to try to prove to themselves and to their communities that no, we're actually not oppressive, we're not racist. Of course, like most institutions, as we talked about earlier, what they do in practice is often very different from those type of statements that are made. And I say that because at my former institution, during our annual reviews, they added this additional criterion of inclusivity, whatever that means. Like, does this person contribute to an inclusive work environment? And as you can probably imagine, there's a lot of issues with that, especially because this institution was predominantly white cis het people, including those in positions of power. And so it felt very icky to be judged on this criterion as someone who holds multiple marginalized identities by these people who like held the dominant identity. So like that was icky in and of itself. But one really validating experience that I had was during one of my annual reviews being told that I didn't meet, like it was rated out of 1 to 5, 5 being like the highest on this rating. I only got a 3 for 1 year because I was told that I don't necessarily do enough at the department level to justify like a 5 on this rating. And again, this rating is coming from people who hold dominant identities. And I was like, I don't know how to explain to them, like, y'all, the nature of my existence in this department is enough because I'm the only, you know, Muslim Arab identifying male in the entire unit that we're in. But that didn't seem to really register. And so for the following year, I was like, okay, I'm gonna heed their feedback and try to do more on a pragmatic level in our institution. So the following year for Arab American Heritage Month, there was a kind of like festival, celebration happening outside in one of the quads. And I didn't even know what's happening. I don't think it was really well advertised, but when I was walking into the office, I saw it. So I was like, this is amazing. I ran up to my desk and I sent out an email to my unit and our diversity, equity, and inclusion committee saying like, hey, y'all, there's Arab American heritage celebration going on. There's food, exhibits, photos. And I mentioned a statement about Palestine because part of the exhibit was what they call the Palestine Museum. It had, pictures and books detailing the situation in Palestine. And in my email, I said, there's a Palestine museum that details the Palestinian people's ongoing struggles against apartheid occupation. And as you can probably imagine, my use of the term apartheid occupation was not very well received by some folks, even the folks in the diversity, equity, and inclusion subcommittees, which was pretty interesting. And I got a little slap on the wrist and had to have a meeting with a couple folks about how that was not proper email etiquette and how email should not be used for political purposes. Although that seemed to not, what didn't register with them is that we already use the email for political conversation because it's a diversity, equity, and inclusion subcommittee. And so I wasn't in a position where I had enough power to challenge this kind of hypocrisy, for lack of better words. So that was definitely challenging as a person of color and Arab American in an institution. Although what that really did in this, maybe this was counterproductive from their perspective, was it just ignited this fire in me to not stay silent. And it highlighted how silent and complicitness in what's happening in the Arab world just feeds this ongoing agenda. So I hope I answered your question. I was kind of long-winded, but that memory is so lucid in me because this just highlighted again, institutions can say all they want about anti-oppressiveness, but what they do in practice is often very different.
Yeah, so it's like, in many ways, the status quo of viewing certain things as acceptable, as inclusive, as political. These were the challenges that you faced because these were dominant folks who were creating that definition. And rather than for you staying silent, you enough is enough, and so one of the way you overcame that is, hey, let's speak up, let's challenge this idea. And honestly, if we truly value critical thinking, then my hope is we will be willing to explore counter ideas as well as just, people's experiences. Now, I just want to check in with you, like, how can we support you?
I think the best way that folks can support me and the way that we can all support each other, especially as people of color in psychology, it's simply to not stay silent about whatever oppression is happening, whether it's what's happening in Palestine, whether it's sexual and gender minority rights, whether it's, the issues of gentrification in Latina communities. I think just using our voice is the best way that we can support each other, especially as, I think being in psychology, especially at the doctoral level, there's so much institutional privilege that comes with that. We, having those 3 letters after our name gives us a lot of clout, which I think can be used nefariously or it can be used to help better the world. And so I think us using that academic privilege to not stay silent is really the best thing that we can do. I think the beauty of academia, the beauty of intellect is that the rhetoric is our tool, like the pen is mightier than the sword. Like all these quotes that sound so cliche are actually so true. And I think that would be my call to action for folks and a call to action to myself.
Fantastic. Well, Hisham, any final thoughts?
Power to the people.
All right, fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for your bravery and your courage. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for yours. I appreciate it.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe to People of Color in Psychology. You can also support us by registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Your feedback is important to us, so feel free to send an email, a message on LinkedIn, or leave a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.